Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today I'll be answering questions from the Battle of Septimus 3. Now, before I get into it, I'll just say that YouTube seems to be suppressing that particular video. For some reason, YouTube doesn't want you hearing about what happened at Septimus 3, but I think it's very important, so if you would, I'd be very grateful if you went back and gave it another look. Thank you very much. Without any further ado, let's get into it. First question is from Mr. Sovig. Why does the Vodchar use a D7 engine? Now, for those of you who are well informed in terms of the military commentary and enthusiast community, you will be very aware of the controversy around Laserpig and the assertions he has made regarding the engine in the T-14 Armata. I can't say anything really regarding the Vodchar engine. However, what I can say for fairly certain is that the Maquis Raider uses the same engine as the Klingon Bird of Prey. Or at least, that's what Lore Reloaded would have us believe. Okay, on to a serious question now from Rella. There's a question of where the KDF's authority ends and where House authority begins. How does Klingon command and control work? Okay, so the Klingon Defense Force is essentially, formally, the full-time standing professional military, and the houses will then raise forces, that might be ships, that might be ground troops, in times of war. However, they are always meant to subordinate to KDF command, not to say that that always necessarily happens. You see, the trouble is that Klingon houses, they essentially have the duty of raising and supplying those troops. And what that means is that they can basically do it however they like. They don't have to do it according to the model of the KDF. And this is quite a useful thing because it means that you can raise alien regiments, you can raise Kzinti, Orions, Gorn, Creotians, whatever you want. And you don't have to drill them as Klingons, you can have them use their own military traditions, and that definitely does make bringing in Imperial contingents much, much easier, but it does also then mean that there isn't this integrated command and control network. So just because the overall KDF commander in a sector passes down an order does not necessarily mean that that order will reach all the subordinates that it needs to, because of how those particular forces may have different rank and command structures. So ostensibly, the KDF has complete authority over all Klingon forces in a time of war. In reality, it's a little bit more complicated, there's a little bit more politics at play, but certainly the idea is that the KDF does have complete control. Because they're the professionals, they know what they're doing. These guys are basically the reservists. From Nathaniel Mead, are all female Klingons based off the Night Bomber Regiment 588? For those of you who don't know, that is a Soviet bomber unit, otherwise known by the Germans as the Night Witches, which is an awesome name. It's fair to say that with regard to female Klingons, I very much do base them off female Soviet troops, not just, or not in fact just Soviet troops, but Women's Battalion of Death from the First World War, under the command of Maria Borokcheva. That definitely is a strong inspiration for female Klingon warriors. There's all these parallels, of course, between the Soviet Union and the Klingons. It's a good sort of touchstone for each of them. Klingons are very comfortable with having female warriors. May have become more of a thing as we get into the 24th century, but even as early as the 23rd century, we definitely see that women are serving in the Klingon military. And so I think all female units would be probably not that uncommon in Klingon culture. Next question from Kieran Hines, with several questions. There's a whole new ship with the fleet that besieges Septimus, and we've never seen it before. What is it? I recognise the artist, but this is the first time we've seen it in battle. So the ship he is referring to is the Klingon L-24 Komo-val. Now, originally the Komo-val, or the L-24 battleship, is a FASA design, and that is very much a TMP era design. If you look at its schematics, it's very much got those sort of D7 Katinga kind of aesthetic in the cells. The Komo-val is a study of that design by Atoll Mazel, who was basically just looking to sort of upgrade and update this ship for the 24th century, which makes a lot of sense. So it's now got more Vorcha-style engines and other such. Essentially, the reason I selected it is because I wanted some kind of Klingon heavy transport to show the scale of the invasion. If you just show D10s, well, those are just for purely transporting, the first wave. With something like the Komo-val, there is actually that ability there to transport large numbers of troops. You also see in that same shot the Klingon transport ship, which is from DS9, which of course is just the upscaled Cardassian transport ship. But again, that can be used again to convey the scale of the invasion in this particular instance. It's not just a preliminary landing by a small number of assault troops. This is full scale, this is large scale. The next question he asks, considering that many of the ships seen here, the Kron and D10, didn't actively participate at Chintoka, is it fair to say that they fled with the rest of the Klingon fleet after both battles, or were just left to the mercy of the Breen? So yeah, the D10s and the Krons were very quickly withdrawn, because once you've completed that initial invasion phase of Septimus 3, you don't need the D10s to hang around, and they are going to very much be needed elsewhere on the front where you're planning further invasions, further landings. Same thing with the Krons. The Krons are essentially a elite vessel at this point. They're very rare. They're kind of like the Klingons' sovereigns. They're going to be very careful about where they deploy them. So yeah, the Krons would also be withdrawn and deployed again elsewhere. So by the time the Breen were attacking, neither of those ships were there, and you were kind of back down to a base Klingon expeditionary force. Third, I'm a little confused about the timeline of events. So yeah, this really falls on me and me thinking I know DS9 better than I do. Essentially, with regards to the timeline of Septimus 3, what we know is that I think as Damar is leaving Cardassia, or after Damar leaves Cardassia, that's where he first brings up the issue of Septimus 3. They then go on their little journey in the Jem'Hadar attack ship, where they eventually meet the Breen. Now, the Breen can't have been all that far away, because the Breen were somewhere near the Badlands, roughly, because Ezri and Worf were in the Badlands, and then they were attacked by Jem'Hadar, where they then crash land. So they've got to be somewhere in near Cardassian space, in or near Cardassian space, and somewhere in or near the Badlands, which in the grand scheme of things is not all that far from Cardassia. It's hard to tell, and possibly there's a band of neutral space or unclaimed space above Cardassian territory. In fact, that's eminently possible, and that's possibly where the Breen found Ezri and Worf. But essentially, the timeline is very dense, and that really just speaks to how dense the timeline is in that point of DS9. They're really rattling through it, and things that are actually taking place over months seem to be taking place over days. So yeah, in reality, the Fall of Septimus 3 was actually quite a long affair, and in the grand scheme of things, in terms of war, yeah, they didn't really hold Septimus 3 for all that long before the Breen joined the war and launched their counterattack. With all these new ships and formations from the Klingons, will we ever see them in depth, free from the chaos and clutter of battle? I can definitely say that with regard to the D10. I went into it in a great deal of detail in the video on assault ships, so check that out. I also previously featured it in the video Klingon Attack, for those of you who are into the TMP era Klingon ships. With regard to the Kron, I am absolutely going to be doing a ship chat on the Kron, so don't worry, that is coming down the line. From SCP Guy, do those supply ships really not have weapons? I mean, the Elkins has an Intrepid saucer, and we know the Olympic has weapons. I just feel like they should have put up more of a fight. We know that the Olympic has weapons. We also know pretty well that the Olympic's weapons are less than useless. So, sticking around to shoot, when you've got other ships that can come along and deal with them, your best option is just to get out of there. You can't really make a valuable contribution other than just sort of token fire to show willing, but you're not exactly going to be doing a lot of damage or making that much of an impact. So it's kind of better to just get out of there, because you're the reason they're there. As the transport ship, you're the target, you're the reason they're there. You hanging around to try and help out is not actually going to help anyone. If anything, it's just going to bring more sharks to the feeding frenzy, so to speak. I would say, yeah, generally the doctrinally appropriate thing to do if you're a transport ship and coming under attack is you just get out of there, because you're the one they want, and if you leave, they'll leave. Okay, next question from Anson Ellis. What was the reasoning behind not using the Lance phaser on the Kron class, and could it use the Vulture's torpedo module? Second, wouldn't the Boreth be an excellent anti-raiding ship, as that is what it was designed for? So the first question with regards to the use of the Lance phaser, or lack of Lance phaser, on the Kron. Basically, the reason that's done is so that it's easier to manufacture, because it's using essentially a slightly scaled down version of the Vulture's main gun module. And in that ilk, yes, it could use the Vulture torpedo module. And part of the reason for that is, well, yeah, it's easy to manufacture. There's plenty of Vultures being made, and it's very easy to sort of just, produce a slightly scaled down bijou version. But the other reason is that the Vulture's the Vulture's disruptor is far more versatile and flexible than the Lance phaser that we see on the Katinga. The reason the Katinga has the Lance phaser is that's all it can mount. It has a lot of shortcomings, and this is all stuff that I will cover in my dedicated video on the Kron, so I will mention it. But yes, suffice it to say that there's the simplifying of logistics. You're not having to build completely separate weapon systems to mount on a class of ship, and it also has a little bit more versatility than the old Lance phaser, which is actually quite a specialist weapon. And then regarding the Boreth class, while it is a decent anti-raiding ship, there's other vessels that can do the job pretty well, in terms of you've got the birds of prey, which are perfectly good at hunting the kinds of ships that are going to be doing raiding. You also have various forms of Federation frigate. It's worth saying that the Klingons have relatively few Boreths. They built relatively few of them, and they see far more utility in them being used as exploitation vessels. So once you break the enemy line, you can send the Boreth through to continually disrupt anything that the enemy has in his rear, whether that's a counterattack that's being prepared, or that's his supply bases and supply lines, supply vessels. And these are all things that can be targeted by the Boreth very effectively. In terms of putting it up in a direct fight against other kind of similar vessels, really, in the grand scheme of things, I mean, it's not going to do terribly, but it's also not the most efficient use of what the Boreth is capable of. The Boreth is very, very fast at warp speed. When it comes to defending raiders, that's generally something that you do at impulse power. And also you want to have a very decisive outcome. The Boreth doesn't really have much in the way of heavy weapons, it just has lots of medium weapons. So, it's good for sort of endurance, and it's able to engage targets no matter how it's maneuvering, which is, quite unusual for Klingon ships. But it's not going to be able to just one-shot an enemy ship, which is quite a good thing to be doing when you're dealing with raiders, because generally with raiders, if they take a single casualty, they're going to leg it. Raiders are a very risk-averse type of enemy, and so if you inflict even a single casualty on them, that's going to be enough to make them turn around and think twice. So Vultures and Katingas are much better for this kind of job than the Boreth. The Boreth is going to do much better in that more offensive capacity, and there's not many of them to begin with. From Dion King, can you do the Battle of Clach-to-Kel Brucht? There was a whole discussion here But essentially, I have done the Battle of Clach-to-Kelbracht in the episode of the Khitomer Massacre, using it as context for Romulan-Klingon relations. I'm not necessarily going to do a full battle space episode. However, if people are interested, I'd be more than willing to do a breakdown of sort of what I showed and talk about some of the ships and what we actually see happening in the battle, and really where the two powers are relative to each other in the 2270s, because it's a very interesting period, and things, rapidly shift either side of that particular decade. The 2270s is an interesting transition point in terms of the Romulan fleet and the emerging and what the Klingon fleet has become. So if you're interested in that, I'd be more than willing to do a video on that. From Frakin Gaius Baltar: was the practice of using Klingon Marines as a military police common among the Klingons? The answer is essentially yes, because as I say, you've got all these levies that they'll be raising, all these levies and conscripts, and probably criminals and prisoners, penal battalions, all of that you'll be throwing into a battlefield. And yeah, you need the KDF basically to just keep these units in order in one form or another. Let's also not forget the nature of Klingon starship design, which is that we have the officers here, a neck, and everyone else back here. And we can also guess that probably between the crew and the neck is probably a barracks where all the ship's complement of Marines are based. So it's something very much that is in Klingon tradition. It makes a lot of sense in terms of, protecting the nobles from the commoners, considering that the Klingons are very much a hierarchical, almost medieval society. So, that makes plenty of sense. And then the funny thing is that in navies, these kinds of practices continued for quite a while. If you look at HMS Caroline, it's very clear that between the crew quarters and the officers' quarters is the Marines' barracks. Now, HMS Caroline is a light cruiser, really designed to just go hunting enemy destroyers. I don't think it was ever intended to engage in amphibious warfare, so to speak. I don't think it was ever planning to land large numbers of Marines, but nonetheless, it has a large number of Royal Marines on board, and they are stationed right between the crew and the officers. I don't know when the last Royal Navy mutiny trying to kill the officers was. I'm going to suspect it was a long, long time ago, but despite this, they're still building ships like Caroline, which is in 1914, by the way. It's literally just at the outbreak of the First World War. This is a new modern ship at that point, and they still have that kind of architecture in the ships. And so, that tradition for the Klingons would very much be important, especially as you are using your professional troops to kind of keep the conscripts and levies in line. From Terran Admiral: why didn't the Federation push for the Klingons that committed the war crimes against the Cardassians to be put on trial? Well, some of them did, but ultimately, you don't want to argue too much. You've got to pick your battles, and frankly, as I said in the episode, it's not like many of the Federation citizens were particularly cared that much what happened to Cardassians, which you might say is very sad, and that they should care about people no matter who they are. And yes, and I would say that's very much a failing of a human psyche, and certainly that is something that the Federation would aspire to, is to care for everyone equally. However, these people are only human, or Andorian or Vulcan or whatever, but these people are only human. They only have a certain capacity to care. And with all the terrible things that have happened in the Dominion War, the Cardassians suffering a massacre at the hands of the Klingons, well, number one, that's sort of par for the course. It's like, well, yeah, they're Klingons, they're going to do that. And then the other half is that, well, you guys kind of have it coming. It's not a nice thing to think, but, that's just being honest about, humans. As nice as we would like to think ourselves, we only have so much empathy. So yeah, very much the Federation picking its battles, and, not wanting to make a massive scandal where they know that all that's going to happen is both sides are going to look bad. They're going to look bad because it means that they're allying with war criminals, or that they allied with war criminals and covered for war criminals. You're going to make the Klingons look bad as well. And so they're not going to do you any favours in the future. Next question from Shannon Carter. What happened to Drex and Reynolds after the first skirmish? Did they participate in any further battles? Was Drex at Septimus with his father attempting to regain his honour? So Drex was at Septimus 3. I think I mentioned that he was calling in danger close fire missions on civilian targets, or just random bits of field that he thought looked a bit Cardassian-y. So yeah, Drex was on Septimus 3, and yes, he was very much trying to regain his honour. So again, there's that sort of personal stake there for Martok. Again, part of why he was perhaps a bit lenient on a lot of the Septimus 3 war criminals is because he had to be a little bit lenient because one of them was his own son. In terms of Reynolds, so there is a bit of a character change in Reynolds. Previously, Reynolds would have probably just bolted right after the Cardassian raiders, and here he doesn't. He stops and gives aid to the Klingon ships. This shows a change in Reynolds' behaviour. When we see Reynolds in DS9, this is in 2374, this is at the outbreak of war, and Reynolds is, well, he's your typical light cruiser commander. He's just swinging for the ropes, and, will only really leg it if he has to. But he's a very hyper-aggressive commander. That's definitely been tempered as the war has gone on. In terms of when that happens, we don't honestly know, but it was probably at some point during the sort of quote-unquote summer lull in 2374, where it very much became a war of raiding. And I can imagine he was involved in not only launching raids himself, but also countering Dominion raids, and that's probably where he lost a lot of ships and became a lot more cautious. The Dominion perhaps got wise to some of his tactics and began setting traps for him, and that's where he started losing people, so he became an awful lot more cautious going forward. Last question from Bloody Smile. Since self-replicating mines exist, why not just create a shipyard that can replicate fleets of ships instead of a long, time-consuming building process? That is an excellent question, and that is ultimately a question that has to be answered in terms of, well, I can do some covering for the writers and their self-replicating minds, but self-replicating minds is a very interesting and quite scary idea. All that would need to happen for self-replicating minds to become incredibly scary and go very wrong is for their programming detection system to malfunction. So a mine knows where it is within the minefield, and so it knows how many mines either side of it there need to be, and that means that it's then able to replicate as is necessary. However, if that didn't exist, or if that was somehow malfunctioned and the mine no longer knew where it was relative in the minefield, and perhaps its sensors malfunctioned and it didn't even know that it was surrounded by mines, or if we just apply this to the mines that form the edge of the minefield, if they don't know that they're the edge of the minefield and they detect open space, what are they going to do? They're going to replicate. And then those mines are going to detect more open space, and they're going to replicate, and they're going to replicate, and they're going to replicate, until eventually you become, there's just this massive wall of self-replicating mines just expanding in the middle of the galaxy. We talk a lot in the current day about, illegal weapons or weapons which it is regarded as criminal to use, like, cluster munitions. That's the big hot topic in the modern day. Well, in many ways, you could argue that self-replicating mines, Rom was a war criminal because he designed a weapon which is incredibly dangerous and poses an indiscriminate threat to civilians. Could be argued. In terms of just, finally, with regards to what I would do instead of having a minefield at DS9 or at the wormhole, is the solution is right in front of you. It's just build a Tholian web, right? And the moment a Dominion ship comes through, you switch it on, and it just gets sliced up by the lasers of the Tholian web. It's not like you don't have that technology. I mean, I know the Tholians, are probably still relatively cagey with that kind of stuff. The Tholians have been doing it for centuries. It really shouldn't be difficult for Starfleet to use it, and it's a very good kind of minefield. It's a way of controlling a choke point, and it also has the advantage that you can turn it on and off. So, only things that you want to come through the wormhole can come through the wormhole. In that way, I'm going to make a Stargate reference. It's very much like the iris on the Earth Stargate. You only have to let through the things that you want. So that would be my alternative suggestion to the self-replicating minds, which are quite a scary thing when you really think about it. So on that note, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you all in the next video. Thank you to my members for supporting the channel. My Navarks, Tully DT, Jeffrey Ballard, Rella, and David Reeves. My dutiful commanders, Nathaniel Mead, Narata, Adam Bowman, DM Tribal Typhoon, Jeff Hallam, James C., Bird Monster, Chase Rector, Philip Ty, Mark Philippe, Robert Sampson, Sean Farrell, Gabe Logan, Martin McConville, Nicholas Walsh, JC Tech Wizard, Rizel 3D, Alcara Demore, and David and Laura. And I salute my Centurions, Pendlebury, Marcus Hall, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, Oculcatum Quaesto, Squadra Course, John Nicole, Athes Collection, Tobias Klein, Greg Martin, Shermos, and LeBron Tessin Alma. And I thank all my loyal sub-lieutenants, and I welcome John and IJWG. Thank you guys for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.